May 8, 1945. London. Whitehall. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally the previous day. The city was sealed off, balconies draped with flags. Crowds packed every street leading toward the government buildings. From inside Whitehall, the sound of celebration was constant, a sustained roar that seeped through stone walls and closed doors. Inside a secure room, Winston Churchill issued an order that stood in total contradiction to the scene outside. Present were the Chiefs of Staff Committee and senior planners of the British Joint Planning Staff. No press, no allies, no minutes intended for circulation. Churchill spoke directly and without preamble. He instructed them to prepare a plan for a full-scale offensive war against the Soviet Union. This was not framed as a contingency. It was not described as a defensive safeguard. It was to be an operational plan for an attack to begin on July 1st, 1945. The target was explicit: the Red Army. Churchill specified the objective in blunt terms: to compel the Soviet Union to comply with British and Allied demands regarding Eastern Europe, particularly Poland. The assumption was that political pressure had failed. Military force was now to be examined as the remaining instrument. The planners did not debate the order. They recorded it and began calculations. Force ratios, timelines, supply lines. The war with Germany was barely concluded, yet Churchill was directing attention to a new conflict with an ally whose armies now occupied half the continent. One instruction stood out immediately. Churchill demanded that every option be explored to offset Soviet numerical superiority. This included, by direct instruction, the possible rearming of surrendered German soldiers currently held by the Western Allies. The number discussed was not symbolic. It was up to 100,000 men. Former Wehrmacht troops, many with years of experience fighting the Red Army, potentially returned to service under British command. The room did not react audibly. No one challenged the premise. The order was recorded, classified, and assigned a planning designation: Operation Unthinkable. Only after the directive was issued did Churchill leave Whitehall to appear on the balcony overlooking the crowds. Cameras captured the moment. He raised his hand in the V sign. Britain celebrated victory. The decision to plan a new war had already been made. It was made in a closed room, in the final days of one conflict, by a prime minister who no longer believed peace was the next phase. The battlefield did not yet exist. The consequences were still theoretical. But the decision itself was complete, formal, and irreversible within the planning system it activated. The cheering below continued. The order moved forward in silence. By early May 1945, the military opportunity confronting Britain existed only within narrow, unforgiving boundaries. It was not imaginary, but it was fragile, temporary, and dependent on conditions that would not last. The Red Army dominated Eastern Europe. Its presence was overwhelming. Approximately 7 million Soviet soldiers stood deployed in the Western Theater, organized into roughly 170 divisions. They possessed clear numerical superiority in tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The Western Allies, by comparison, fielded approximately 4 million troops across 47 divisions. These forces were stretched from the Low Countries to southern Germany, tasked with occupation duties, demobilization, and preparation for redeployment to the Pacific. Yet the opportunity Churchill perceived did not lie in parity or strength. It lay in timing. The Soviet advance had been relentless. Berlin had fallen. German resistance had collapsed faster than Soviet logistics could fully adapt. Soviet supply lines now stretched hundreds of miles eastward, feeding massive formations through damaged rail networks and devastated infrastructure. Fuel, maintenance, and coordination lagged behind the speed of conquest. Units were deployed across vast territories that had changed hands in weeks, not months. The Red Army was formidable, but it was not yet consolidated. Western Allied forces retained critical advantages. They possessed intact logistics networks anchored to ports in Western Europe. Their armies were fully motorized, better supplied, and supported by overwhelming strategic air power. The Western Allies also maintained near-total control of the skies west of the Elbe. Soviet air power, while numerically strong, was oriented eastward and forward, focused on supporting ground advances rather than countering deep interdiction. From a purely operational perspective, planners identified that the Red Army's forward posture created exposed flanks. Soviet formations were aligned for occupation and stabilization, not for immediate defense against a mechanized counterstroke from the west. Intelligence assessments suggested gaps in coordination between Soviet fronts and limited experience operating against Western-style combined arms maneuvers under sustained air attack. Speed and surprise were the only variables that could compensate for Allied inferiority in numbers. The hypothetical concept was not a war of attrition. It was a short, violent attempt to force a political outcome before Soviet advantages could be fully mobilized. A concentrated strike, launched without warning, aimed to disrupt Soviet cohesion, seize key ground in Germany and Poland, and create a crisis that Stalin would be forced to address diplomatically. Every assumption rested on compression of time. The Western Allies could not fight a prolonged campaign. American divisions were scheduled for redeployment against Japan. British manpower reserves were exhausted. Public tolerance for renewed war was non-existent. The opportunity existed only before demobilization began in earnest, and before Soviet forces could redeploy, reorganize, and fortify their positions. This was why Churchill pressed for a July start date. Within that window, planners examined force augmentation options. The most controversial was also the most militarily logical under the constraints imposed. Surrendered German soldiers represented a reservoir of trained manpower immediately available within Allied-controlled territory. Many had spent years fighting the Red Army. They understood Soviet operational methods, strengths, and weaknesses in a way no Western unit could replicate quickly. Rearming them was not conceived as ideological rehabilitation. It was a calculation. German units could bolster frontline strength, fill gaps, and delay Soviet counteroffensives long enough for political pressure to take effect. Without them, Allied planners acknowledged that numerical disparity would be decisive. The opportunity, therefore, was conditional. It depended on surprise, concentration, temporary logistical imbalance on the Soviet side, and the willingness to exploit morally and politically toxic options. It assumed that Stalin would hesitate, calculate, and negotiate rather than immediately commit to total war. The planners did not pretend these conditions were stable. Every assessment emphasized deterioration over time. Each week that passed strengthened the Red Army's position and weakened the Western Allies' ability to act. Operation Unthinkable was not built on confidence. It was built on a rapidly closing gap between what was still barely possible and what would soon become impossible. The opportunity existed only because the war had ended too quickly for the battlefield to settle. Churchill's assessment did not emerge from impulse or emotion. It was the product of long observation, repeated frustration, and a conviction that political agreements without force behind them were meaningless. He had watched the alliance with the Soviet Union evolve from necessity into dependency. At Tehran, he observed how American confidence displaced British caution. At Yalta, he witnessed concessions formalized while Soviet armies already occupied the ground those concessions concerned. By the spring of 1945, Churchill no longer believed that diplomacy alone could shape the postwar settlement. His warning was not delivered publicly. It was embedded in preparation. Churchill understood that the decisive phase was not the defeat of Germany, but the distribution of power that followed. He judged that once Soviet forces consolidated their occupation of Eastern Europe, no combination of protests, notes, or conferences would reverse it. Military facts would become permanent political facts. The death of Roosevelt sharpened that judgment. The American president, who had consistently deferred to Stalin, was gone. His successor, Harry Truman, was untested and still forming his views. Churchill recognized this as a brief moment of uncertainty at the top of the American system, a pause before policy hardened. That pause, he believed, was the only remaining window in which pressure could be applied. Churchill's preparation was procedural, not theatrical. He did not order mobilization. He did not issue threats. He demanded analysis. The Joint Planning Staff were instructed to examine the situation without political filtering. They were to identify force ratios, potential axes of advance, logistical limitations, and likely Soviet responses. Churchill did not ask them to prove the plan workable. He asked them to prove whether it was possible. This distinction mattered. He anticipated resistance from his own military leadership. British generals were trained to avoid unwinnable wars, not to manufacture leverage through risk. Churchill countered this institutional caution by framing the task narrowly. The plan was not to defeat the Soviet Union outright. It was to apply sufficient shock to alter Stalin's calculations before the strategic balance became irreversible. Churchill's credibility rested on consistency. He had warned about Hitler when warnings were unwelcome. He had warned about appeasement when compromise was popular. He now warned about Soviet intentions at a moment when public relief demanded peace, not confrontation. His previous accuracy gave weight to his current alarm, even among officers who doubted the feasibility of action. Preparation extended beyond force calculations. Churchill understood morale, symbolism, and psychology as instruments of strategy. He believed that Stalin respected only strength and that hesitation invited expansion. A credible plan, even if never executed, would signal resolve to allies and adversaries alike. The most controversial element of preparation reflected this mindset. Rearming German soldiers was not conceived as an act of reconciliation or redemption. It was a stopgap measure designed to create immediate mass and familiarity with Soviet methods. Churchill did not romanticize the idea. He viewed it as distasteful but necessary, a temporary alignment dictated by circumstance rather than principle. He also understood the risk of internal fracture. British public opinion would recoil at the notion. Allied unity could crack under the strain. American support was uncertain at best. Yet Churchill believed that failing to prepare carried a greater risk, permanent strategic marginalization. The warning embedded in his actions was directed as much inward as outward. He was signaling to his own institutions that the war had not resolved the central question of European security. He was warning that victory without leverage was incomplete. Churchill did not expect enthusiasm from his planners. He expected resistance, calculation, and reluctance. That was acceptable. What he would not accept was complacency. His preparation transformed anxiety into process. It forced the British military system to confront an outcome it preferred not to imagine. In doing so, he anchored his warning not in speeches or memoirs, but in staff papers, tables of equipment, and projections of loss. The warning was not that war was inevitable. It was that inaction was a decision with consequences as final as action. By ordering planning, Churchill ensured that those consequences would be understood in advance, even if they were never acted upon. The plan did not collapse under enemy pressure. It stalled under the weight of the system that surrounded it. Once the Joint Planning Staff began formal analysis, the distance between Churchill's intent and institutional reality became unavoidable. The numbers were not disputed. The conclusions were not ambiguous. Any offensive against the Soviet Union would begin from a position of inferiority and would deteriorate rapidly once initial momentum was lost. The chiefs of staff did not reject the task. They constrained it. Their role was not to challenge political authority, but to translate it into executable action. In doing so, they introduced friction at every stage. Each briefing emphasized limitations rather than opportunities. Each estimate widened the gap between political desire and military feasibility. The first barrier was alliance dependency. Britain could not act alone. Any operation of the scale Churchill envisioned required American participation. Yet no American commitment existed. Washington had not requested planning. Truman had issued no directive. The United States was already redirecting attention toward Japan, where an invasion was expected to cost hundreds of thousands of casualties. American commanders were preparing to rotate divisions out of Europe, not entrench them for another continental war. Without American agreement, Operation Unthinkable was an abstraction. British planners understood this and reflected it in their assessments. Every operational concept was framed with conditional language. Success assumed full American engagement. Failure assumed hesitation. The absence of clarity itself became a decisive constraint. The second barrier was public legitimacy. The war in Europe had ended days earlier. British cities were celebrating survival, not bracing for sacrifice. The population had endured 6 years of bombing, rationing, and loss. There was no narrative that could justify immediate war against a former ally whose soldiers had died by the millions fighting Germany. The chiefs of staff recognized this as more than a morale issue. It was a strategic vulnerability. Any prolonged conflict would require mobilization, industrial output, and sustained political consent. None of these were available. The rearming of German soldiers exposed this contradiction most sharply. From a narrow operational standpoint, the proposal addressed a numerical problem. From an institutional standpoint, it was radioactive. German units had surrendered weeks earlier. War crimes investigations were ongoing. Displaced persons camps were still being organized. To reissue weapons to former enemies would undermine the moral foundation on which the Allied victory had been built. The planners recorded this without editorializing. They simply noted the likely consequences: loss of domestic support, fracture of Allied cohesion, and irreparable damage to Britain's international standing. The third barrier was escalation control. Any clash with Soviet forces risked rapid expansion beyond the European theater. The Soviet Union possessed immense strategic depth. Its reserves were not theoretical. Its leadership had already demonstrated a willingness to absorb losses that Western governments would not tolerate. The chiefs of staff warned that a limited offensive could not remain limited. If initial attacks failed to produce political concessions, the only alternatives would be withdrawal or escalation. Withdrawal would signal weakness. Escalation would invite disaster. There was no stable middle ground. Churchill's authority could initiate planning, but it could not override these structural realities. The British military system was designed to absorb political direction and temper it with institutional memory. That memory was shaped by 2 world wars fought to exhaustion. It favored containment over gamble. American influence amplified this restraint. Combined planning mechanisms ensured that unilateral British action was visible even if not authorized. Liaison officers, shared intelligence, and joint commands created a constant feedback loop. Any hint of offensive intent against the Soviet Union risked preemptive diplomatic rupture. Churchill faced this resistance without illusion. He understood that his leverage lay not in command authority, but in persuasion. He attempted to frame the plan as insurance rather than provocation. He emphasized that planning did not mandate execution. He argued that preparedness itself could influence negotiations. The system responded by narrowing the plan further. Operational concepts became increasingly defensive in character, despite the original directive. Scenarios were constructed around worst-case outcomes. The emphasis shifted from achieving objectives to surviving consequences. The planners effectively transformed an offensive mandate into a demonstration of infeasibility. This was not insubordination. It was process. The final barrier was political transition. Churchill's government was approaching an election. The military leadership was acutely aware that political authority might soon change hands. No chief of staff would commit the nation to war without certainty of continuity at the top. Planning could continue. Commitment could not. As these pressures accumulated, Operation Unthinkable lost momentum without being canceled. It existed in files, memoranda, and annexes. It generated analysis, but no orders. It became a reference point rather than a directive. The overrule did not occur in a single moment or through a single decision. It occurred through accumulation. Each constraint reinforced the next. Each institution acted within its mandate. The result was paralysis without confrontation. Churchill was not defeated by argument. He was contained by the system he led. The plan remained technically alive, but politically inert. Its existence signaled fear. Its dormancy reflected reality. By the time planning concluded, the question was no longer whether the offensive could succeed. It was whether the state could survive the attempt. The consequences of the decision unfolded without a single shot being fired, yet they were no less real for remaining confined to paper. Once the joint planning staff completed their assessments, the implications became unavoidable. Every scenario produced the same trajectory. An initial Allied offensive might achieve limited tactical success in the opening phase, driven by surprise and concentrated air power. Soviet forward units could be dislocated. Lines of communication might be disrupted. For days, perhaps weeks, the appearance of momentum could be sustained. But the response was already calculated. The Red Army would not collapse. It would absorb the shock, stabilize its fronts, and counterattack with mass. Soviet doctrine was built on attrition and depth. Losses were expected, accounted for, and politically tolerated. Reinforcements would arrive from the east in quantities the Western Allies could not match. Once the front stabilized, numerical superiority would become decisive. From that moment, the initiative would be lost. British planners traced the likely sequence with precision. Allied units, stretched thin and operating at the end of extended supply lines, would be forced into defensive postures. Air superiority would degrade as Soviet air forces redeployed westward and airfields became contested. Logistics hubs in Germany and the Low Countries would come under sustained pressure. The counteroffensive would not stop at the original line of contact. The most conservative estimates projected Soviet advances deep into Western Europe. The Rhine was not considered a reliable barrier. Allied ground forces lacked the reserves to hold a prolonged defensive line against mass Soviet formations. American divisions earmarked for redeployment to the Pacific would not be available. British manpower reserves were exhausted. The planning documents did not exaggerate. They listed consequences sequentially, each one contingent on the last. Loss of Germany, collapse of occupation authority, forced evacuation of Allied governments from the continent. In the most extreme projections, the planners acknowledged the possibility of Soviet forces reaching the Channel ports. Britain itself would face existential risk, not through immediate invasion, but through strategic isolation and exhaustion. The rearming of German troops did not alter this outcome. It delayed it. Planners evaluated the integration of former Wehrmacht units with cold efficiency. German soldiers could provide immediate manpower. Their familiarity with Soviet tactics offered short-term advantages. They could stiffen defensive lines and extend operational endurance. They could not change the strategic balance. German units lacked heavy equipment, modern logistics, and political legitimacy. Their presence would complicate command structures and strain cohesion. Any battlefield gains achieved with their assistance would carry political costs that compounded with every casualty. The longer they fought, the more corrosive their role became. The moral consequences were not abstract. British officers warned that Allied troops might refuse to fight alongside former enemies. Resistance movements across Europe would react unpredictably. Governments in exile, recently restored, would face legitimacy crises if German units re-entered their territories under British command. Even victory would be destabilizing. Beyond military projections, the consequences extended into alliance relations. Planning for Operation Unthinkable altered how American and British leaders perceived one another. Trust eroded quietly. British insistence on contingency planning signaled fear of abandonment. American reluctance signaled prioritization of disengagement. These tensions did not break the alliance. They reshaped it. The knowledge that Britain had contemplated offensive war against the Soviet Union hardened American caution. It reinforced the belief that Europe was a liability rather than a foundation. The center of gravity shifted toward the Pacific and, later, toward nuclear deterrence rather than conventional confrontation. For the Soviet Union, the consequences were indirect but lasting. Although there is no evidence that Stalin knew the details of Operation Unthinkable at the time, Soviet intelligence was acutely aware of Western unease. The rapid demobilization of Western forces did not reassure Moscow. The mere possibility of confrontation reinforced Stalin's determination to secure buffer states and consolidate control. Eastern Europe was not occupied temporarily. It was reorganized, purged, and integrated. The planning of Operation Unthinkable, even in secrecy, contributed to the logic that shaped the post-war order. Both sides assumed hostility would eventually replace alliance. Both sides prepared accordingly. On the British domestic front, the consequences were political. Churchill's fixation on Soviet threat did not resonate with an electorate exhausted by war. The public wanted housing, employment, and peace. Military planners returning casualty projections for a hypothetical new war reinforced perceptions that continued leadership under Churchill meant continued sacrifice. The election that followed was not decided by Operation Unthinkable alone, but the mindset that produced it was increasingly out of step with public priorities. Within the military establishment, the consequences were doctrinal. Operation Unthinkable became a reference case for institutional restraint. It demonstrated the limits of political will when unsupported by resources, allies, and legitimacy. It reinforced a preference for deterrence, balance, and indirect pressure over direct confrontation. The British Army emerged from the planning process with clarity, not optimism. They understood that conventional war against the Soviet Union was unwinnable on acceptable terms. This understanding shaped force planning for years, pushing Britain toward reliance on American power and, eventually, nuclear deterrence. The most immediate consequence was silence. The plan was filed, classified, and buried within restricted archives. No public debate followed. No parliamentary vote was taken. No explanation was offered. The decision dissolved into administrative inertia. Yet its shadow remained. When the Iron Curtain descended, British leaders understood that the outcome Churchill feared had materialized without resistance. Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Czechoslovakia fell under Soviet control. The political map of Europe hardened along lines drawn by occupation forces, not by conferences. Operation Unthinkable did not fail on the battlefield. It failed before leaving the page. Its consequences were not measured in casualties, but in acceptance. Acceptance that Western power had limits. Acceptance that Eastern Europe was lost without war. Acceptance that peace would be defined by division rather than settlement. The planning process forced this acceptance into the open within the British state, even as it remained hidden from the public. In that sense, the consequence of the decision was not action, but recognition. Recognition that the war had ended, but the contest had not. Recognition that force could no longer rewrite the outcome without destroying what had been saved. Recognition that restraint, however unsatisfying, was the only survivable option. Operation Unthinkable demonstrated the boundary between fear-driven resolve and strategic reality. It revealed what would happen if that boundary were crossed, not through imagination, but through calculation. The consequences were written down, reviewed, and quietly agreed upon. They were decisive precisely because they were never tested. The post-war record closed the file without ambiguity. When Britain's archives began releasing classified material in the late 1990s, Operation Unthinkable emerged not as rumor or exaggeration, but as a documented planning effort ordered at the highest level. The memoranda, force tables, and staff assessments revealed a proposal that had progressed far beyond casual speculation. It had been structured, analyzed, and judged. The judgment was unanimous. The Joint Planning Staff concluded that the operation carried a low probability of success and an extreme probability of catastrophic failure. This was not a divided assessment. It was not hedged language. The planners stated plainly that Allied forces would likely be defeated and driven back with severe losses, potentially leading to the loss of Western Europe. These conclusions were not written for public consumption. They were internal documents, intended only for senior leadership. Their tone was clinical. Their confidence was high. The files also clarified the scale of the gamble. Even optimistic scenarios assumed that success depended on Soviet hesitation rather than Allied strength. There was no projection in which the Western Allies achieved decisive military victory. At best, they could force a temporary crisis. At worst, they would trigger a war they could not control. The rearming of German soldiers, often treated in later commentary as the most shocking aspect of the plan, was recorded without ideological justification. The planners did not debate morality. They evaluated feasibility. Their conclusion was that German units could marginally improve early force ratios, but would introduce severe political and command complications. The advantage was tactical and temporary. The cost was strategic and permanent. Post-war historians examining these documents reached consistent conclusions. Churchill's strategic instinct regarding Soviet intentions proved accurate. Eastern Europe did fall under Soviet domination. The Iron Curtain did descend. His fear was justified. His remedy was not. The record shows that Britain lacked the material strength, political legitimacy, and alliance cohesion required to enforce a different outcome by force. The planning documents demonstrate that this was understood at the time, not discovered in hindsight. The election of July 1945 formalized the end of the project. Clement Attlee's government inherited the files, but not the impulse behind them. There was no attempt to revive the plan. It was archived, sealed, and left untouched as Britain shifted toward reconstruction and social reform. Yet the influence of Operation Unthinkable did not vanish. Within military institutions, it became an unspoken reference point. It informed assessments of Soviet power throughout the late 1940s. It reinforced skepticism toward conventional war on the European continent. It contributed to the British embrace of deterrence, alliance dependence, and ultimately nuclear strategy as substitutes for mass armies Britain could no longer field. In American planning circles, the logic was parallel. The impossibility of conventional confrontation without unacceptable cost encouraged reliance on atomic monopoly and later nuclear balance. The Cold War that followed was shaped less by ambition than by constraint. The Soviet record, though less explicit, aligns with this interpretation. Stalin acted as if confrontation was inevitable but delayed. He consolidated territory, neutralized opposition, and accelerated military readiness. Whether or not he knew of Operation Unthinkable in detail, he behaved as though Western hostility was a permanent condition. The historical verdict drawn from the documents is precise. Operation Unthinkable was not suppressed because it was immoral. It was suppressed because it was unsustainable. It offered no path to victory that preserved what the Allies claimed to defend. It converted legitimate strategic anxiety into a military gamble that the British state could not survive. Churchill's reputation after the war absorbed this contradiction. He was remembered as a prophet who warned of Soviet expansion, not as the leader who briefly considered stopping it by force. The archive corrected the imbalance, but did not overturn the consensus. The post-war record does not rehabilitate the plan. It explains it. It shows a statesman confronting the limits of power at the moment of victory. It shows an institution capable of restraining political will through analysis rather than defiance. It shows how fear was translated into paperwork, examined, and quietly rejected. Operation Unthinkable did not change history through action. It clarified history through refusal. By the time the files were opened, the world they described no longer existed. Europe was divided. Alliances were fixed. Nuclear weapons had replaced armies as arbiters of survival. The plan was revealed too late to matter operationally, but not too late to understand. The record confirms that the final battles of the Second World War ended not with gunfire, but with recognition of limits. Recognition that some outcomes, once set in motion, could no longer be reversed without destroying the victor along with the defeated. That recognition is what remained in the files when the case was finally closed. Operation Unthinkable is a closed case. The decision was made in May 1945, at the moment of victory, when Britain's power appeared intact and its influence assumed. Winston Churchill ordered preparation for an offensive war against the Soviet Union. The objective was political coercion, not military victory. The method relied on speed, surprise, and the temporary exploitation of forces that could not be sustained. The military analysis was decisive. Allied forces were outnumbered, overextended, and dependent on American participation that did not exist. Any initial success would have been brief. Soviet counteroffensive capacity was overwhelming. The likely outcome was defeat on the continent and strategic exhaustion at home. The plan required measures that undercut the very legitimacy Britain claimed to defend. Rearming German soldiers introduced tactical mass, but destroyed political coherence. Alliance unity, public consent, and moral authority would not have survived prolonged conflict. Churchill's assessment of Soviet intentions proved accurate. Eastern Europe was lost. Stalin did consolidate power. The threat was real. The response was not. Operation Unthinkable converted strategic anxiety into a military gamble that Britain could not afford and could not win. The British state recognized this before a single order was issued. The system restrained the decision without confrontation, without rebellion, and without publicity. The plan was not cancelled. It was rendered inert. Churchill lost office weeks later. The files were sealed. Britain turned inward to rebuild. Europe divided along lines already fixed by occupation armies. History did not turn on the plan's execution. It turned on its rejection. The record shows a moment when political will reached beyond material power and was pulled back by institutional reality. It shows that foresight does not guarantee viable action. It shows that some outcomes, once established by force of arms, cannot be undone without greater destruction. Operation Unthinkable stands as evidence, not of aggression, but of limitation. The war ended. The balance remained. The case is closed. If you want more investigations like this, subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment. The archives are not finished speaking.